Despite a lot of smiling and hugging of koala bears, Vladimir Putin left early from the G20 summit in Australia after receiving heavy criticism from Western leaders. So what's Russia's next move going to be in Ukraine, and how will the West respond? That all depends, firstly, on whether Russia pursues further military action in Ukraine. NATO has explicitly accused the Russians in the past week of moving more troops into Ukraine. The implication is that Russia is intent on pursuing further military action, but of what sort? There are two ideas that are doing the rounds. One fear is that Russia now has decided that it will have to have what is known as a land bridge between Russia and Crimea, which it annexed earlier this year, and that would involve further fighting along the coast, and in particular the resumption of hostilities around the city of Mariupol, which is where the fighting stopped a few months back. The even more alarming scenario that sometimes does the rounds is that Russia actually is intent on annexing the whole of an area that has now taken to referring to as Novorossiya, which is essentially a fifth of current Ukraine and taking in all of the coastline. But if Russia were to do that, it would be involved in a partisan war in Ukraine, so the risks would be enormous. And it's also clear that there would be a very strong Western reaction, even stronger than the sanctions that have now been pursued. So if Russia does escalate the fighting, how is the West likely to respond? The West's already passed sanctions, but speaking to American officials a couple of weeks ago, one of them described the sanctions that they've gone through already as about 2 to 3 on a scale of 10. In other words, there's a lot more that could be done if we really wanted to start damaging the Russian economy, in particular much more stringent financial sanctions, which then might effectively cut Russia off from the global financial system. But that would be risky. It would be risky for us, it could cause financial chaos in Russia, and it would cause yet another dramatic deterioration in relations. However, it's felt to be one step short of the really dramatic scenario, which is a big debate currently going on in the United States in particular, which is if the fighting escalates, should the US and perhaps the Europeans start supplying weapons to the Ukrainian government, allowing them to fight back more effectively? There is a big lobby pressing for that in the US, but the Russians have warned explicitly, both in public and behind the scenes, that that would be a very dramatic escalation of the conflict. And they've even talked about, again, behind the scenes, that they might, at that point, decide that they would invade the whole of Ukraine. And there have been dark noises made about not forgetting that Russia is a nuclear power. So all of that suggests that Russia is very keen to, if you like, intimidate the West into not supplying Ukraine with weapons. But if the fighting escalates, it's going to be very hard to avoid at least a debate about that question. And if Russia does not escalate the fighting, what happens then? Well, obviously, those in Europe and the US are hoping that the fighting will now stop or be frozen. And at that point, you're looking at what people call a frozen conflict, where bits of eastern Ukraine have eventually fallen out of the control of the Ukrainian government, but the bloodshed stopped. The question is, can you stabilize that? And at what point does the West then start trying to rebuild relations with Russia? The big question would be, do we start thinking about lifting sanctions? And I think it would come up most quickly in the European Union, because after about a year, the EU has to formally either renew or not renew sanctions. If Russia holds off on the fighting, then it's possible that in about a year's time, the European Union will begin to relax sanctions. But that's a long way away right now. In summary, the big question to look out for really is what happens on the ground in Ukraine. Is there a further escalation of fighting? How far do the Russians push it? If that happens, the next question to look for is, firstly, will there be further sanctions, to which I think the answer is almost certainly yes. And then most crucially, does the West decide to start supplying arms to the Ukrainian government? And if it does, how ferocious would the Russian reaction be to that? The more hopeful scenario, though, is that the Russians do not, in fact, escalate fighting, and that there is now a period in which both sides can step back, pause, and gradually de-escalate the conflict and perhaps at some point return to a more normal economic relationship.